The Man in the Corner. Late at night, Mark often found himself alone in his office, the dim glow of his desk lamp the only source of light. He worked long hours, drowning himself in spreadsheets and reports to avoid the silence that filled his apartment. But lately, the silence wasn't the problem. It was the feeling of being watched. It started with a shadow, a fleeting glimpse in his peripheral vision, always just out of reach. He brushed it off as stress at first. After all, he had been under immense pressure at work. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing night. There was something, or someone, watching him. One evening, as Mark typed away at his computer, he caught the shadow again. This time, it lingered in the corner of the room, a tall, indistinct figure that seemed to sway slightly, like it was breathing. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned his head to look directly at it, but just as before, the corner was empty. Shaking his head, Mark muttered to himself, "Get it together." He stood up, deciding it was time for a break. Maybe a drink would calm his nerves. As he walked to the kitchen, he couldn't shake the eerie sensation that the shadow was following him, moving just out of sight, waiting for him to turn around. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, his hands trembling slightly. It was nothing, just stress. He took a deep breath and downed the drink, letting the warmth settle his nerves. But when he turned to leave the kitchen, he froze. There it was again, the shadow. This time, it wasn't in his peripheral vision. It stood directly in front of him, just beyond the kitchen doorway. Tall, dark, and featureless, its presence filled the room with a suffocating sense of dread. Mark's heart leapt into his throat. He blinked, and the figure was gone. Shaking, Mark backed into the kitchen counter, gripping the edge for support. "This isn't real," he whispered. "I'm imagining things." But it felt real, too real. And now, there was a new fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. What if it was real? That night, Mark barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadow in the corner of his bedroom, standing still, watching him. He tossed and turned, hoping that the morning light would chase away the fear. But it didn't. Days passed, and the shadow became more than a fleeting image. It started appearing during the day, at the office, in meetings, out of the corner of his eye in the elevator. Always there, always just watching. His co-workers noticed the bags under his eyes, his frayed nerves, but when they asked if he was okay, Mark only nodded. How could he tell them he was being followed by a shadow? They'd think he was losing his mind. Maybe he was. One evening, Mark decided to confront it. He couldn't live like this anymore, trapped in his own fear, haunted by something he couldn't explain. He waited until nightfall, when the apartment was quiet and the darkness outside mirrored the shadows creeping in his mind. He sat in the center of the living room, facing the corner where the shadow always appeared. The air felt heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. "I know you're there," Mark said, his voice trembling but resolute. "Show yourself." For a moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. But then, slowly, the shadow began to form. It seeped out of the corner like smoke, taking shape until it was the tall, indistinct figure that had haunted him for weeks. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't look away. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice barely more than a whisper. The shadow didn't speak. It didn't move. But something shifted in the air, an oppressive weight that pressed down on Mark, making it hard to breathe. His mind raced. Had he made a mistake? Was this thing real, or was he spiraling into madness? Then, without warning, the shadow lunged at him. Mark screamed and fell backward, scrambling to his feet, his pulse racing in his ears. But when he looked again, the shadow was gone. He stood there, panting, his eyes scanning the room wildly. The apartment was empty, but the feeling of being watched remained. In the days that followed, Mark became a shell of himself. He no longer slept, ate, or worked. Every corner of his home felt like a trap, every shadow a lurking threat. He tried to escape, checked into a hotel, stayed with friends, but the shadow followed. It was always there, waiting for him to be alone again. Finally, one night, Mark reached his breaking point. He grabbed his phone and dialed a therapist, anyone who could help. He sat on the couch, the phone ringing in his hand, staring at the far corner of the room. But as the call connected, Mark's heart sank. There, standing in the corner, was the shadow. Only this time, it wasn't just watching. It was smiling.